My name is Nathaniel Robert Walker. I teach architectural history at the Catholic University of America in the School of Architecture there. It's a great honor to do so. Before I was there, I spent 8 years teaching architectural history at the College of Charleston, just across the street. And when I arrived in the year 2014, fresh out of grad school in New England, the Gilliard Center for the Performing Arts was in the final throes of construction. So I got to watch that building enter into its full life, and then for 7.5 years or so, serve this city in ways that were even greater than anyone could have anticipated. More was asked of that remarkable building than anyone could have seen coming, and that building has delivered on every single possible level, as far as I could tell, as it has become a beating heart of art and politics in the city of Charleston. So just to share you a little anecdote of how much that building has become a part of the cultural landscape of this place, is that at one point early in my career here, I was asked to help lead a tour of the city for a bunch of foreign dignitaries that had been brought to Charleston by the National Park Service to talk about the ways that stories about slavery could be told in historic districts and on historic sites. They came from countries in West Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America. It was part of a larger Atlantic World Conference about historic preservation and cultural heritage in the context of Atlantic world slavery. And as we hopped on a public trolley bus and were zipping around the city, I was pointing out different monuments, and as we got to the Gilliard, the bus driver actually interrupted me. He said, "Excuse me, sir, can you please hold on a second, because I want to point out the Gilliard, a building of which everybody in this city is extremely proud, and it's brand new, and it has changed the city for the better. I just want you to know that the city is still alive. It's not just old stuff, it's also new stuff, and that it is at least as important as all the buildings you've talked about so far." And I thought, okay, Charleston is not the kind of place where it's hard to find an architectural opinion, but it's rare to find such in-depth critical thinking randomly on any given day on a bus from somebody who you've never met before. But it just goes to show you, I think, it says a lot about the city, but it also says a lot about the Gilliard. And of course, a lot about that amazing bus driver. So I have some good news and some bad news about this, our final session of the conference, not including the wonderful tour at ION that you definitely should go to. The bad news is that David Schwartz, the founder and of course the main presence at David Schwartz Architects, is not feeling so hot, and he wasn't able to be here today. The good news is that he sent Steve Knight in his place, and Steve Knight was right at the heart of the design and construction of the Gilliard. You can't ask for anyone better. And in fact, Steve, of course, led the tour yesterday. And so for those of you who are on that tour, some of what you'll hear today is a bit of a refresher, but we're also going to go deeper into certain elements of the process and of the building. So I'm very glad that Steve is here, and if you don't mind, I'll say a few words about him. He is a principal with David M. Schwartz Architects. Originally from Massachusetts and raised in North Carolina, Steve settled in between after settling his Master of Architecture from North Carolina State University, and now working and living in Washington, D.C., or at least living in Maryland and working in Washington, D.C., and making both places cooler for it. The same year that he joined DM SAS was the year he graduated from architecture school, so he has given a lot to that firm. While well-versed in a variety of project types, Steve primarily focuses on the firm's performing arts venue projects. He served as project architect for the design of the Schermerhorn Symphony Center, which is, of course, in Nashville, a very famous and beautiful concert hall that if you haven't seen, you should. The Palladium at the Center for the Performing Arts, the Gilliard Center here in Charleston, and most recently an 8,000-seat amphitheater in Huntsville, Alabama. He is currently leading the office's team on the design of a neighborhood center for Chevy Chase Lake in Maryland, which is a heroic act indeed. He's also a major figure in Washington's preservation scene. He's president of the Art Deco Society of Washington, and just this week he gave a guest lecture in my Architecture of the United States class on Art Deco, which was very well received. He's a hardworking man, folks. This is a hardworking man. Sitting next to him is Michael T. Maher, who's originally from Milwaukee, but has been an important figure in Charleston for many years and was central to the whole process by which the Gilliard was made politically and financially possible, and by which it came into full and flowering life. He's the founder and chairman today he's the CEO of the West Edge Foundation Incorporated, the nonprofit redevelopment entity that is building the West Edge Innovation District, Charleston's 21st century commitment to progress and economic advancement in the art of making a vibrant and diverse city. Michael is, as I mentioned a moment ago, a native of Milwaukee, and he's also an architect, receiving his Bachelor of Science in Architectural Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and his Master of Architecture from Rice University. As a practicing architect and city planner, he has collaborated on several award-winning projects, as well as numerous prize-winning entries in international competitions. He has been nationally recognized for his teaching excellence, receiving the ACSA and AIAS New Faculty National Teaching Award. Prior to his leadership of West Edge, Michael was the founding director of the Charleston Civic Design Center and lead representative for the City of Charleston on the Gilliard Center Arts Precinct. And as you'll hear, I hope, as this conversation unfolds, that put him in the heart of many a difficult but productive conversation about that enormous project a few blocks away. So, if you don't mind, please welcome these two illustrious fellows.
Good morning, everyone. So what we want to do is sort of relatively quickly, in kind of a tag team fashion, walk you through the project. I know a number of you got to see it yesterday on a tour, but probably a larger number of you did not. So we'll start there. Hopefully some interesting stories will unfold, and we really want to approach this in a very conversational fashion. The project started in 2008. It started originally as let's find a way to spruce up this 1960s era municipal auditorium that had really fallen on hard times. It was very dated, wasn't very well used, and very operationally and acoustically obsolete for what the city needed. The client at the time was the Spoleto organization, Spoleto USA, the great festival that happens here every year in late May. And so what unfolded it took about 2 years of various feasibility studies looking at what we could do with this building. And so really over the project's life, about 7 to 8 years, we got to know the city very well. And obviously I have gotten to know nearly every corner just walking around. It's such a wonderful, walkable city. And clearly the residential fabric of Charleston is really fabulous. And I agree, it's very much about not just the houses themselves, but the spaces between the houses, the streets, the places, the alleys, the lanes, and of course the gardens. And I think there's an interesting contribution in the Gilliard that we'll touch on, which is this public park on one side of the building. And that really did grow out of, we really did look very carefully at the great tradition of gardens and landscape design that we find here. There's a great tradition of public buildings here in Charleston as well, from the churches, some cultural and civic buildings as well. So we, it's very important to us that we look very carefully and closely at what's here and really trying to embrace it. I think what ultimately is so fabulous about and why we're so lucky to work on big projects like this is really building a holistic statement of a community and what they aspire to be.
Yeah, so here's some of the past. As you've all come here, as so many people come to Charleston, they get to experience the city as it is today and try to understand its history. I've often said that the experience of Charleston today is a city, an architectural and urban fabric that is more intact than it has ever been in its history, which is a bit of a paradox. How can something be more intact today than when it was actually first built? But I think through the course of our history, Charleston has come to the place where it is today really through three important processes. One is the process of preservation. Secondly, process of restoration, and third, reparation. And preservation obviously is keeping the fabric that you have and making sure that it survives and is not demolished. Restoration and the preservation in Charleston really is a process that begins generally in the 1920s and then through the 20th and now 21st century. process of restoration, of repairing the damage of time, of deterioration, of neglect, and of alteration. And that's a process in Charleston that really begins in full force in the 1980s, in part due to the damages that were created and the opportunity that came out of Hurricane Hugo. The process of reparation is something both architectural and urbanistic, of repairing damages. So Charleston has a long history of disasters, wars, fires, earthquakes, hurricanes, economic destitution, all of which were detrimental to the fabric and history of the city, and the architecture. And the process of repairing that damage is really what you see today. And one disaster that fortunately generally avoided Charleston was good old 1960s urban renewal. But we did have a couple of instances, and one of the most significant and pertinent today was that urban renewal project that led to the Gilliard Auditorium. And so in the 1950s and 60s, parts of about 3 city blocks of dense historic fabric, an African-American neighborhood, were demolished through a process of slum clearance to create the opportunity to build the municipal auditorium, which eventually became the Gilliard Auditorium. And so what you see in these images is that contrast between the fabric that was there, and that fabric was there all the way through the 20th century until the 1950s. And then the Gilliard, in its full glory after its completion in 1968, a civic building set in a grassy field with a surface parking lot in front of it. Obviously not at all a part of the city of Charleston. But that urban renewal sets the ground for, that urban renewal attempt has set the ground for what really is the Gilliard Center's repair of that disaster. And as we go through this whole presentation, I think it has to be put in the context of all of the work that has been done architecturally, urbanistically, contextually, to take something that did not fit, to make it into something that enhanced and advanced the city in the 21st century.
And that neighborhood was actually pretty prosperous. It was not a slum by any means. And it was primarily African American, but there were a lot of white families in it too. And it was the mixed neighborhoods actually that were targeted in the early 20th century by so-called modernizing mayors and reformers, as they attempted to increase the segregation of this very historically mixed peninsula. And so this had every element of classic urban renewal, including the kind of racial hygiene theories that were a part of the modern movement, by the way, but were also central to visions of the New South and kind of lost cause segregation. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
So I think, as Steve alluded to, the beginnings of the vision for what to do with this building started with just simply how do we reskin this to make it into something that seems to be appropriate in Charleston. But the process very quickly advanced to really thinking about this much more holistically of how to repair the urban fabric. And so the beginnings of that were to look at this building not as a reskin, but as a reformatting of the building. And that process started with the idea of simply wrapping the building with another building, and not reskinning it, or if you will, reskinning it with a very, very thick skin. The process of that also was made possible by the city identifying a need for a new municipal building to consolidate all of its different departments into one place. And so that became a very important urbanistic opportunity for making that thick skin around this building, but it also became an important financial component of how to make the project possible, both from a feasibility standpoint, but also from a political standpoint. And so that thick skin essentially became the city offices, the consolidation of all city offices into a new building that wrapped the existing building.
That's the section and footprint of the original Gilliard, rather. 2,700-seat municipal auditorium to the left, kind of a shared through lobby in the center, and then to the right of the page was an exhibit hall.
You know, and luckily, the great modernist tradition of withdrawing from the urban periphery to withdrawing from the street actually provided a lot of real estate in which to put some urbanistically engaged and healthy and elegant architecture.
I often thought of the original building as kind of the budget version of the Kennedy Center, for anybody who's familiar with that in Washington. Set back from the street, this kind of very monumental porch element that wrapped the perimeter of it. Programmatically, one of the things we learned was that this civic auditorium, 2,700 seats, was much too large of a venue. They could rarely fill it up with any programming, so a lot of it sat empty. And in doing some market analysis, we determined that about 1,800 seats was the sweet spot to hit. And within that was a great opportunity for the hall itself. We could shrink the footprint, acoustically optimize the volume and shape of the room, and also provide space for kind of state-of-the-art patron uses, restrooms, lobbies, and so forth. And then, Michael, do you want to touch a little bit about the wrapping of the municipal offices?
Yeah, there are, I think, two components that the city was looking at in this project. One was the city offices, as I mentioned. The city at that point in time had offices around the city in about more than a dozen leased spaces. The only beneficiary of that was really if you own Class C office space in a bad building in Charleston, the city was willing to lease space from you. Inefficient for the city as an operations and not very good for the morale of the workers. The city's other focus on this, in addition, of course, to the auditorium, or the theater space, or performance space, was the convention space, or the exhibition hall was really what it was called, the other side of that lobby space. And it was really, truly underperforming financially for the city. The whole facility was a draw on the city budget by between $1.5 million and $2 million a year. And so it was not well used because it was not very usable and not very attractive. And I didn't find the slide, but we have a really great slide from early on where they actually were having there were cows in the exhibition hall lined up for a fair show, I guess it was. But it was used for everything and nothing, if you will. And so for the city, the goal for this project was to enhance all aspects of it, and the exhibition hall becoming really another asset for the city and the community as a true conference and convention type of space, not a convention hall, but very usable, was an important way of bringing along city council in the city's making its investment in the project.
And of course, as you can imagine, I mean, this is a neighborhood that's still reeling from the original one. So when word gets out that a tremendous amount of money, public money, as well as some private donations, but the full combination, the full recipe of how that all played out was not yet set in stone. Everyone knew there was going to be public money at some point invested in this project. There was opposition. There was neighborhood opposition. There was opposition from every preservation group that exists in this city. There was opposition from the architecture scene, especially when it became clear that there was going to be a traditional design kind of on the table. And so one of Michael Maher's responsibilities was to work carefully with Mayor Riley, who was already at this point a very seasoned politician who was elected on a racial reconciliation platform in the 70s and had never failed to serve that core mission. To bring people to the table, to nurse the argument, to convince those who could be convinced, and to outflank those who couldn't. Was that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you may or may not be familiar with the city's design review processes. The city's Board of Architecture Review is one of the oldest design review boards in the country. The city's very proud of that. It is a process that's been a part of design and construction in Charleston since then. And it's not a process that, should we say, is the most efficient or most effective at creating the city that we all want to see. This building, as Nathaniel alluded to, was not popular. The design of this building was not popular as it was going through the design review process. There was an alliance of opposition that was wide-ranging. And so the fight to bring forward this design intact and to the benefit of the city and the benefit of this area was a fight that the whole team engaged in. And yeah, my role in part was as a kind of middle child, if you will, between the community, between the design team, between the politicians, and the design community to try to come forth with a strategy, both efforts at the macro and micro level to make this project possible in the manner in which this design team and their vision really needed to come forward.
And you're really good at handling carpetbagger architects from out of town.
Yeah. You want me to tell the story?
Go right ahead.
All right. So in lieu of David, who would tell this story in a much better fashion, as a way of illustration of how this opposition really can manifest itself, but also how you have to fight it. So in one of the meetings with the neighborhood association, the Anson Borough Neighborhood Association, they had a very strong voice who was an architect who practiced in Miami, who had moved to Charleston into Anson Borough in an old house. You know how architects do that, right? Modernist architects. So he had his voice. He actually had his alternate plan that they had designed. The green space would have been the big circular drop-off in front of the Gilliard.
For those Miami Lamborghinis? Or what?
Yeah, and also, the interest of the neighborhood was to get all of the activity away from the neighborhood, not to be engaged into the neighborhood. So they had their own agenda, if you will. This particular architect was very tall and very outspoken. David is not particularly tall, but he's also very strongly positioned. And so we had a meeting. This architect got up and started spouting off about all the things that were wrong with the design. And the BAR process is one in which the community is supposed to have its say. And whether we like it or not, whether they're wrong or not, they have their say. And I think David, in this particular case, came forth with the authority and the confidence and the willingness to engage with that authority, and essentially took that tall architect from elsewhere and made him very, very small in that room in the way that only David really could do. And it really set the tone not just for the platform that this architect had created for himself, it set the tone going forward for how discussions about the design of this building were going to be had. It was not a negotiation of the macro ideas about what this building and what the design ethic of this building would be. It was more how this building and that design ethic could really be brought into focus to make it the best building for that city, that part of the city, and for that neighborhood, as well as for the city as a whole and the building in the end.
One of the things David said in that one of those first BAR meetings was, is this the project we would have done had we had a clean slate? Probably not, but we did not have a clean slate. What we had was a set of very complex conditions that we had to work around. We had this, in essence, a super block that was created with the Urban Renewal Project, about 500 feet long, and the basic disposition of the uses was set. We had this auditorium at one end that had a stage house, a fly tower, if you will, about 100 feet tall. That was, in essence, a non-conforming use at that point. Through the zoning ordinance, which had a cap at about 50 feet or 5 stories. So we really had to hold on to that. So when you have such a strong organizing element like that, you pretty much are left with leaving the existing disposition in place and then working around it.
And I think I wasn't there at that meeting, but I imagine that even if the conversation was somewhat confrontational, that it was a relief and maybe a comfort for the public to see that this wasn't going to be a poorly thought through bureaucratic milksop project that had all sorts of unintended consequences, but had a strong and convicted architect at the helm who came with principles and with values that were going to steer the project. I mean, that alone, I think, assuages some of the fears over a large civic project that had previously, on the same site, done unspeakable harm.
Mm-hmm. For my sins, as an anecdote, that particular architect moved into my building, and So the condo board meetings, as you can imagine.
Okay. He's not your new best bud?
No.
No, okay. These are some slides. The BAR process was very interesting, and I think we did win the board over. I think our first, there's 3 rounds we had to go through, and we were either unanimous or near unanimous at all 3. But these were the types of some of the tools that we brought to the table, really just trying to really focus on the edges that we were intending to create. It was very important. This is the George Street side. The building, in essence, has 2 fronts. There's the George Street exposure that faces the neighborhood that Michael talked about, and then the Calhoun Street side, which is more public, which has that park. Again, over 500 feet long. How do you fit in with a major civic building in what is essentially a historic, fine-grained residential neighborhood? And you do it by breaking down the scale of the building. Simultaneously, we had a really interesting opportunity, as we like to say, preserving several legacy live oak trees that were very important to the city and the community. So we stepped the building back at the wings that you see to the right and left to preserve those trees. I think tactically it helped pull the scale of the building down. And we could really then kind of celebrate and focus on a nicely scaled crescent entry forecourt in the middle. That's one of the primary entrances into the building.
There was some risk in that because what we learned through the process, because these trees were all planted when the Gilyard was built in the first place, so in 1968. And the live oaks like that, apparently their root systems get so intertwined, they're effectively one tree. And we did assessments of all the trees. One of the trees was particularly sick. Mm-hmm. And so there was a risk through this whole design process that we might get through designing it all around all these trees. We took out the one tree that was going to die, but we had a risk that could spread to all the other trees, and we'll have designed this building around those trees, and those trees may not have survived. They did fortunately survive, and now they're really thriving. Yeah. And I think the interplay between the building and the landscape, which is again part and parcel of the fabric of the city, and particularly of Ansonboro, is really important. And I think it's one of the things that grounds this building in its context, in its immediate context, so successfully.
Yeah.
It's very hard to take a facade that's that long and maintain both unity and variety in its articulation. Yeah. And
it's hard to photograph the building, too.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to photograph the building unless you're, in a drone. So there was a clear decision taken to learn from France, to learn from Paris, right, in this architecture. And I remember that I even saw some of the newspaper articles that criticized that suggested that French Baroque architecture did not belong in Charleston or something to that effect. It wasn't, in the theme park code. Yeah. But it seemed like a good model. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Sure.
Steve?
Well, I mean, there's a very important French heritage in Charleston with the Huguenots who came here to escape religious persecution. This idea of this crescent and this forecourt entry really stuck with us. And at the same time, we wanted a major civic entrance. So the idea of the elevated portico, which is it's very common in Charleston, was the right move. The scale of it was so small that it felt right to introduce a concave surface into the front of the portico, in essence continuing the curvilinear geometry of the crescent. And it really became kind of a major motif for us that we just, as we were delving in, looking at the precedents and the examples that utilize that kind of language, we struck upon just really furthering it in the details. You see a lot of curving re-entrant corners. There's a lot of curves throughout the interior of the building.
Mm-hmm. There's another aspect that if you know the larger fabric of the city that made this appropriate on the George Street facade, because this is a street that goes from, it's not a long street, but it goes from the Gilyard to the College of Charleston. Mm-hmm. And along that route you have these little green spaces with porticos, whether it's the College of Charleston and Randolph Hall, now the Gilyard, and in between the Spoleto headquarters, about halfway in between. Yeah. That they all have this kind of dialogue along that street. So it's not just about the one block, it's really about the 4 blocks of George Street and how this all kind of bookends it.
Yeah. This is probably a very instructive comparison here, the kind of the before and the after. You get a very clear sense of where the additions and insertions and interventions took place.
Just I'll use this as a lever,
Oh,
because
I
something
see.
that we do want to talk about that's so important about this building, and it's coming to fruition, is not the architecture or even the design team. It's the other team that is essential, and that is the team of patronage. And this building doesn't happen without the leadership and patronage of 2 people, Mayor Riley and Martha Ingram. And they came to it from very different perspectives. They both love their city. Mayor Riley, at the beginning of the Gilliard process, had been mayor for 8 terms, 32 years. I think, and I never want to speak for Mayor Riley. He speaks well for himself. But I leave it that at that point, there were three matters of unfinished business that he felt, as much as he left a legacy to the city, that he wanted to try to accomplish. And he took 2 more terms and then worked overtime, if you will. One was the International African American Museum and how to make that come to fruition. And he began his political career by making a walk from Charleston to Columbia in 1975 to argue of taking down off of the State House the Confederate flag. And so the beginnings of his political career, not as mayor but as a state representative at the time, were rooted in that. And so that International African American Museum he saw as essential to his legacy. And he's worked hard to make it happen and like I said, worked overtime to make it come to fruition. Secondly, there was a big challenge in this city. In 2008 of flooding. We have a much worse challenge today with flooding because of accelerations in those challenges of sea level rise. And we had a gap in trying to make the city's largest infrastructure project, a flooding project, actually be able to happen. And the mayor really wanted to make that happen and worked on it for about 10 years. And then third was what to do with the darn Gilliard Auditorium. Spoleto had been really a great asset for the city, and they were asking the same questions. What can we do with this awful Gilliard Auditorium? And so coming up with a strategy of how to resolve that third piece was really important. By coincidence and clever leadership and understanding public finance, the mayor actually used the Gilliard project to help close the gap on the funding of the stormwater project. That was number 2 on that list. But then Martha Ingram, like Mayor Riley, a native of this city, she had made her name elsewhere, accomplished this elsewhere, but wanted to give a gift to this city and a legacy on behalf of herself and her family. And those 2 together formed the backbone of making a difficult process actually achievable. We were all in service to that patronage and that leadership.
I remember I spoke to Martha Ingram about this project, and when she grew up here in Charleston, her father was in broadcasting, and she would go on the radio and she would DJ on the radio as a teenager. And she was always interested in music and in the performing arts, but it wasn't until she left Charleston that she really felt like her full capacity to experience the performing arts was brought into its maturity because there were other opportunities in bigger cities than Charleston had. And so when she became one of the world's most successful businesswomen in Nashville, Tennessee, she was instrumental in getting the Schermerhorn done there, and she wanted to give a similar blessing to her hometown. So yeah, without her, I can't imagine it would either exist or be at this quality.
Yeah, and to understand their dynamic and their passions, if you will. So we were in a meeting in the Civic Design Center. We did a lot of these meetings in the Civic Design Center. Throughout the whole process, one of the elements of outreach were the amazing models and the amazing array of models that the design team put together to help the community, as well as the design team, understand the design and how it would change the city. So we're in one of these meetings, and it was talking about the interiors, and the topic of color came up. And so the design team and David Schwartz had gone to Mayor Riley and Martha and said, when we're working on the interior, what's the color scheme? And the mayor looked at Martha and deferred and said, well, Martha, what is the color scheme? And she said,
Apricot. I want this room to be apricot. It took us 6 months to figure out what the hell she meant by apricot. We went to every paint rep, trying to get swatches and samples. We mixed colors, hand-mixed paint colors ourselves, showed her endless samples. No, no, no. Finally, she went to Home Depot on her own on a weekend and got one of the little paint chips and came to the next meeting and said, here, this is apricot. This is what I mean by apricot. So,
Very good. And your firm, Steve, is famous for weaving local traditions into the classical language, into column capitals and into entablatures. The Gilliard has a few that have proven to be, I would argue, revolutionarily important and prescient, and help the building serve the city in ways no one anticipated.
yeah, maybe if you go back to that detail shot of the auditorium, I can just point out a few things.
Oh, okay.
So, iconography, I think it's the next one.
I think there's
That's
there you go.
perfect.
Yeah.
Iconography, weaving in local traditions, symbols, is really important, and to help make projects, buildings that are really rooted and relevant to their communities. We love developing our own unique column orders. So in this case, this is the Gilliard order. So we started as kind of a point of inspiration, a beaked Ionic or a Corinthian order as the starting point. In the volutes, because it's a place of the arts and music, we inserted an inverted musical clef. The state flower is the star jessamine, so that's in there. The crescent and the palmetto are two of the symbols on the state flag. And then there's this strong tradition in the Low Country culture, the Gullah culture. This is the African American community that's still very intact along the Atlantic coast of North and South Carolina and Georgia, of woven baskets. You may have seen them if you've walked through the market. And they're made from a native sweetgrass. So this notion of weaving we thought was really interesting, and you see that kind of peeking through here and there, like the seat end stanchions and the column capitals and elsewhere.
And those woven sweetgrass baskets they do represent a tangible cultural link to West Africa. They still make baskets the same way in Sierra Leone today as they make in the South Carolina Low Country. And so this building essentially makes an argument that Charleston, modern Charleston, for all of its French ambitions, is inextricably tied to the weaving of these different continents and these different peoples. That it is European, and it is African, and it is Caribbean, and it is Charleston, and it's American. And that touched a lot of people. I mean, I know for a fact, living here and teaching here for 7.5 years and spending a lot of time in that building, that motif touched a lot of hearts. And it ended up being, turning this building into a tangible, fluent hearth for the continued valorization of African contributions to the making of this beautiful city. For example, there are a number of things that are almost unbelievable. Do you mind if I step out of this chair for a second and point at the map? Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
So, Michael talked about how Mayor Riley was really committed not only to getting this auditorium done, but getting the International African American Museum done. And it turned out they shared some crucial real estate, that the Gilliard and the African American Museum are both placed on this enormous piece of real estate that you see here in this colonial era map called Gadsden's Wharf. That is a hand-built, enormous dock that was put together by enslaved labor. It was the largest piece of maritime infrastructure in British North America. And for a very crucial period in the history of this city, it was actually the only place you could directly bring slavery ships from West Africa into the United States. And so it was ground zero for the most intense period and the most horrific period of the transatlantic slave trade. As the Gilliard was under construction, they found an unmarked African burial ground on the soil, meaning that the Gilliard was, tied as it is to Gadsden's Wharf, and the footprint there, which is where the African American Museum was recently completed last year, on the waterfront edge of that same wharf. that the Gilliard is on sacred ground, and that sacred ground is tied to the suffering and to the resilience of black Charlestonians. And so that sweetgrass basket motif that puts their contributions to the making of this city forward as central to the city's heritage, to its classical heritage, because they fired the bricks, they cut the timber, they wrung the iron, they did all of the labor, and a lot of the design, actually, that put this city together, that the Gilliard becomes a valorization, a celebration of the interweaving of peoples as well as of sweetgrass. And so a number of things have taken place in the Gilliard and around the Gilliard, making the most of this remarkable design decision that I don't think, Steve, you guys could have known how much it would touch the people of Charleston, because you didn't know there was an unmarked African burial ground there. No. Nobody was talking about Gadsden's Wharf and its role in the slave trade until the African American Museum was coming online there. None of this was in the air, but the Gilliard became a perfect place in which to breathe it in once it was. As you can see on the bottom right hand, that's the enormous civic celebration with the current mayor, John Tecklenburg, for the reinterment of the bodies that were found, many of whom had tooth filings and had colonial coins on their eyes that told us that they came directly from West Africa, the bodies that were found there. There's now going to be a permanent memorial done, used with the castings of the hands of black citizens in the city that will be assembled together in a fountain that's going to be right there on that piece of ground they left open to save the oak trees, and is now becoming a sacred place of commemoration for black Charlestonians. And on the left, you can see the sets for Porgy and Bess, which was a big Spoleto performance in which Jonathan Green, a local Gullah Geechee artist, argued, you know, a lot of people are talking trash about classical architecture since this rat of a guy, Dylan Roof, killed 9 people in the Mother Emanuel Church just a few blocks from here and almost across the street from the Gilliard, because before he went on his racist rampage in that church, he toured a bunch of sites of Southern heritage and of colonial heritage, and he took a bunch of hate selfies next to plantation houses. A number of the people who were operating old house museums and plantation museums were getting death threats after that happened, and people were calling all over the country for Confederate monuments to come down. And so the fact is that, you know, Jonathan Green, when he designed the sets for Porgy and Bess in the Gilliard with columns that celebrate black heritage, he said, look, the architecture of Charleston is classical, yes, and it has a lot of European motifs, but it was built by black people, and if you actually go to West Africa and you look at traditional African architecture, it's almost the same. You have columns, you have beautiful metalwork, you have human-scale doors and windows. Charleston is a mix, and all we have to do is put a few West African ornaments on those buildings, and suddenly it speaks to everybody. And houses around the city began to put on temporary tattoos of little colorful diamonds to celebrate this kind of Afro-Caribbean heritage movement that Jonathan Green started with these Africanized Charleston architecture sets. And the Gilliard was home to it all. And those sweetgrass bass columns framed it all. Whether it's the burial ground or this new vision of a classical architecture that explicitly celebrates African heritage, the Gilliard was there for it all. And it was breathtaking to watch.
We'll take some questions.
Yes, good idea. We have a little time left for questions. There's an itinerant microphone coming right towards you.
Hi, could you speak more on, this is working, okay. Could you speak more on why there was so much opposition to this beautiful project? Was it the scale, the massing, the tree preservation, and what you all did to get the preservation organizations to buy into this?
I would probably start with the fear of the unknown and the fear of, oh God, not this again. You know, these are, so I think that was probably true of one segment of the population. When you live with something that's very real and in front of you, that's what you know. And somebody's coming in and touting doing something different. It's just that's just the fundamental of change and how we manage change is the important lesson here. Mm-hmm. I think also fundamentally there was a very entitled segment of this community that was just I mean, they just, it was a point of pride for them that they could beat back any change or any other project that had come before their neighborhood. You could probably
Yeah,
add a
I
lot
think
more
I think
comment to
the different levers that people would use to affect that opposition. You know, the scale obviously, and I think the design team learned along the way that drawing that 500-foot elevation and presenting it to the community wasn't the most effective way to communicate that, because you didn't understand the three-dimensionality of that. And so that was kind of a cudgel that was used quite a bit. I think scale also had to do with the fact that the city came forth saying, this building, this facility is not successful. There were no activities really going on there outside of Spoleto events and occasional activities that occur there. And so the purpose was to activate this building. And for the community surrounding it, that activation was seen as absolutely a negative, because the peacefulness of their neighborhood would be threatened by that. Although the fruition of this is that there's been really no impact, I think it's fair to say, negative impact from the activities in the facility, partly through some of the important tweaks that the design went through. So certainly there was a segment of the population, and particularly in as an architect, the architectural professional community, who saw this as not taking advantage of the opportunity of creating a new signature building in Charleston. And that was one of the strategies very early on that the whole team embraced, was doing it on this site, in this place. That redoing or repairing this was a necessary act, but also avoided really what would have been unending argument about, okay, if we don't do it here, where do we do it and how do we do it? You know, from the Sydney Opera House approach to putting it on the waterfront, to not doing it in downtown and doing it where it's more accessible to the rest of the community. So it opened up a whole set of arguments, would have opened up a whole set of arguments. We'd still be talking today about where and how the city would get its new signature theater performing venue. So some of that was strategic to avoid some of those arguments, and not to give more ammunition. I'm not sure if we've covered all of the pieces of that opposition, but the result from the team, the massing approach. You know, when you go out there today, forget about that 500-foot facade, because you never perceive that.
You never see it that way.
The way in which this wrapper very skillfully modulates the massing so that the scale of this building really fits the scale of Ansonboro, I think, is incredibly successful. And the language and all of the efforts of this building rooted it in its place in a way that this building could not occur and would not occur anywhere else in Charleston or anywhere. Mm-hmm. You know, the Gilliard Auditorium was that classic. I mean, you can find one just like it in Richmond. You can find one just like it in Savannah. It is placeless, and it is uninterpretive of its place. This building couldn't be done the way the Gilliard Center could not be done anywhere else, because of the language of the architecture, because of the language of the urbanism, because of the skillful effort to take this really large program and really large facility and make it fit a city the scale and grain and texture of Charleston.
Did you have a question too, Steve?
I did. It's a quick one.
Sorry, I can repeat it probably. Oh, okay.
Is there any chance that what you described as a more principle-based process of BIR review, is there any chance that that has spilled over into subsequent projects that were not this one, or did everything revert back to what we as outsiders see as a very contentious process?
The city has tried to reform the process, in some ways successfully, in some ways not so successfully. Some of it was just we had design review meetings where the Gilliard Center was on the agenda with enclosing a piazza on a house. And so at that time, the BAR and design review covered everything from the scale of enclosing a piazza or replacing a front door on a historic property to a project the scale of the Gilliard. And in some ways, they were kind of given the same amount of time. Now, we did eventually have a special meeting for the Gilliard as we needed to, but the process was not set up for that. The city has now reformed that, so we have a large and small BAR, so that each of those gets the right level of consideration, and that the board itself is also focused in that way, and they have people on the BAR large, which are different than the BAR small, so they bring different skill sets, different understandings, and so forth. That, I think, was a part of the Gilliard process that did inform the city. It wasn't a direct result of, but it clearly demonstrated the shortcomings of that process, and they've adapted some to that. Have we solved the contentiousness problem? No. Have we solved the race to mediocrity that the process often sets up? I don't think we've gotten that yet.